are live. Stop recording. Turn on the presentation. Cool. Door. So welcome to part 3 of my workshop series where I tell you guys all about the things that I learned about card games by playing way too many of them. Jesse, you're the only new person here. Do you want me to actually explain this workshop series to you, or should I just keep going?
I figured I was going.
Sounds good. Okay, so today we are going to start talking about the idea of resource systems. Resource systems are one of those other central systems that basically every card game needs, and that is always kind of a big part of how our card game works, together with the combat system. Matter of fact, these are kind of the two really, there we go. These are kind of the two really central systems of every card game in a lot of ways. Does this work? No, that just does the audio. So, what is a resource system? Or what do resource systems do? Why do we have resources to manage? Why do we give our players resources? I realized I didn't put it in a proper definition. When I say a resource system, is everyone basically clear on the vague idea of what I'm talking about here?
I think so. It's like kind of like in the Pokemon TCG where you have the different elemental cards and stuff, sort of.
Yeah, the energy cards, lands.
Or
yeah.
Even in Yu-Gi-Oh where you straight up sacrifice your monsters.
Yep.
Or you know.
Exactly. Yes, these are all resources. So that's exactly what we're talking about. So why does basically every card game have some kind of a resource system? What is the purpose of this? Well, I've kind of enumerated four key things that every resource system needs to do. And like with combat systems, these roles don't have to be fulfilled by every single resource system. Oftentimes resource systems will not do these 4 roles. These are just 4 things that basically every card game needs to get done somehow, and it's usually done by the resource system, if that makes sense. Now why do we want to do this? There are spoilers on the slides, but I want you guys to...
So they have to make a decision of what to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the case of card games where you have monsters, you don't want to be able to summon your most powerful monster as soon as you draw it with no drawbacks. It's kind of overpowered.
But why?
Keep the imbalance.
But if everyone can do it...
But then, it comes down
Also,
to luck.
balance is not valuable in and of itself. Balance is only valuable for what it can do for the gameplay.
Okay.
Then it'll help to prolong the gameplay.
Prolong the gameplay, force the player to make decisions.
It adds a risk and reward system. It forces you to make commitments whenever you want to do something instead of just doing whatever you want just because you can.
Yep. These are all very good things that resource systems do. I think the big one that I put on the board, or on the slide, right, is it creates strategic conundrum, as we talked about in the last section. Right? It forces the player to make a decision. They can't just do everything they want to do. They have to choose between the many things they can do, which one is the most valuable to them. Which we're all about strategic conundrum because card games are basically a subset of strategy games, so we're happy with that. This one's a little more new, so I'm just going to explain this one. Resource systems can act as safety release valves, right?
Sure, your systems don't break because a bunch of things are going on.
Exactly, right? Part of being a systemic game is sometimes the systems can confound upon themselves and create weird problematic reactions. The basic example would be an infinite combo, but that's a specific subset of just how a system can kind of grow parasitic in and of itself if left unchecked. And so one of the things resource systems do is they say that, well, things can never get that bad. If the system ever gets that out of hand, this is the one guaranteed limiting reagent that will stop the problematic thing in its tracks, right? At some point in Magic the Gathering, you will just run out of mana and you'll have to stop doing stuff, right? Or inversely, anything that's too problematic would require too high a commitment of mana to be that viable, right? That's what I mean when I say a resource system is a safety release valve, right? things can never get too bad, because if they do, you just slam into the resource system, and it stops the problematic thing dead in its tracks, one way or another. It means that no one right. Any questions, comments, concerns, notifications, and givings about these first few functions of a resource system we've discussed?
Could you count like tapping an artifact in Magic as like a resource? Like,
Keep it in the corner.
it's kind of like a one-off thing.
Hypothetically, yes. There's no real strong line for what does and doesn't count as a resource, and you can make a compelling argument that it should be counted as a resource.
I think for this workshop, we're gonna like look more into like actual things that are counted as resources than like
Correct.
things like tapping or like when on place, because
Correct.
those are like one-time effects.
Yeah. I mean, I think tapping in general actually does really, if you want to analyze tapping, I think looking at it the lens of a resource is actually a really good way to look at the role tapping serves. But that's not that is, you are correct in saying that is not the kind of thing that we are going to specifically look at here. Hello, Kyle, welcome. Any questions about the words on the slide before I move on to the next slide?
Yeah, there's no visual, but this is a chart.
No? Cool. So more things that they do for us. Resource systems are really good at breaking the game into phases. Does anyone want to talk to me about how they do that and why we care about them being able to do that?
It just, I mean, you can create a whole nother phase just for, okay, spend your resources, allocate it to the things that you want. Right?
Not turn phases, by the way. I'm talking about phases of the game as a whole, like early game, mid game, late game.
Well, you can start in the beginning of the game by like, it gives you agency in how you try to collect and use your resources, because you can say, okay, beginning of the game, I'm just gonna hog as much of it as I can and not use it, and then use it all later and destroy it. Or you can be like, okay, I'll consistently use it to keep up with the other players. Creates the strategic conundrum in that sense.
Yep. And now versus later strategic conundrum with resources. You want to talk about scenarios where that's specifically true?
It adds like a flow to the gameplay too, like, cause compare Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Where Pokemon, you get your Pokemon and then you have to slowly like add in more like resources or like energy resources or whatever they're called to like slowly eventually be able to fight. Well, in Yu-Gi-Oh! You just throw down a guy and your resource system is basically your health points in a way.
Your resource system is actually normal summons.
I mean, still though, cause like you can still, it's a different type of resource. You can still attack a lot faster.
Yes.
So it also affects the pace of the game.
And then
in
you
a
like,
way.
Is it normal summons in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just like placing one monster?
Yeah, and a normal monster.
The
without
one monster
having-
you get to place for free from your hand every turn is your actual main resource in that game. If you want to look at
I
what
wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking that like more like tapping, like it's still in that realm.
they're both resources. I'd say the more relevant one is normal summons. If you actually want to look at a game that really highlights the importance of resource systems, look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Because Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a resource system. It's kind of a cool and original, unique one, right? That's based around normal summoning monsters, and then an extension of that sacrificing monsters, which sacrifice their normal summons essentially at that point. But also, Yu-Gi-Oh! Really, really likes to just pretend it doesn't have that resource and just give you free summons all over the place, which kind of subverts the whole point of having a resource system.
And I feel like 3 is too much.
Don't most
This is
board games nowadays do that now?
No, Magic is actually extremely religious about not giving you free mana and making you pay mana for things. Most card games are very religious about not giving you extra resources and making you pay resources for things.
Okay.
Because it does so much good for them.
Okay.
Okay, that time.
Talk more
No,
about
no,
that
where were you at?
because I can see
I
how
was like around
you can
3.
use resources to try
No, the thing is
to
sometimes. Oh, actually,
slow down the game or create strategies of hoarding resources or
Mhm.
spending them like.
These are all valuable
linearly.
things. Yeah.
But is there any other way of like
that time.
using
Yes.
resources divided?
So one of the objectives we have in game design, that is not at all. There we go. One of the things we want to do that I don't think we've actually done a workshop on this year. Somehow this is one of the topics that slipped by the cracks because there are too many topics in game design to talk about everything every year. Is the idea of variation. Variation is an important concept in game design based on the principle that, and if you do one thing too many times, it gets boring for your players. Now, that's an entire other workshop in and of itself, but it breaks down to you want the one playthrough of your game to not be homogeneous, right? To have players do different things at different points during your game is a desirable quality. We call it internal variation. Resources are very good at creating internal variation by breaking the game into, this is when I have a very limited amount of resources and I have to play resources very conservatively. This is when I have an appropriate amount of resources, and this is where I have an abundance of resources. And these three scenarios play very differently within the same game, and thus create this desirable quality called internal variation. Does that make sense? Questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings? Yes.
So resource systems introduced to a game create internal variation just because they limit what you can do at any one point in time. Therefore, depending on the game state, you'll take different paths.
No. If you have a homogeneous amount of resource, for example, if I get 3 resource per turn period, I would not have created internal variation. Resources are useful as a tool to create internal variation by way of varying how much resource you have at any given point in time.
So it pushes the burden of variance onto a resource system as
Which
opposed
is-
to nebulous somehow.
Exactly, and it's very easy to deliberately vary the resource and then by extension create this internal variation as opposed to, as you said, dealing with a nebula
Couldn't
somehow.
you just deal with the cost instead of the actual number that you get? Couldn't you just have some things cost more than others and that creates enough variation? Especially
Well,
if you're actively...
If you always have access to everything, you're still dealing with the same. If every turn I have 3 resources and a 1, a 2, and a 3 cost, every turn I'm still doing the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can you also alter resources and like, so like in,
That's the way I'm seeing it.
in Magic, you get 1 card at the end of every turn and like
Mhm.
that's all you get. So if you play 5 cards, you draw 1 card.
Correct.
And then you have other cards that help you draw more cards.
Yes.
But in like, what's it called?
And I think
Keyforge, you go up to your 6th card limit every single time.
Correct.
So the resources in Keyforge of the cards is not as much as a resource because in the other one, you gotta play your cards carefully because then you'll just have no cards. And then you don't have any choices, but in Keyforge,
I'd
you
say-
always have the 6
I'd say not
possible
even 3, I'd
choices
say
or
go
the
for
3
like
possible
2.
choices.
I would make a case that in both of these cases we are very much dealing with a resource. Right? In Keyforge, how many cards you have in hand still does all the things we talked about. It does limit you. It doesn't really create internal variation because it's a constant amount.
Yeah.
But it does limit you. It does force you to make decisions. It does, stop you. You just can't play that many cards in a turn because you only have 6 cards to play.
It's like that's the winning strategy. It's a dominant strategy. You just charge it.
They're just resources you manage very, very differently.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking more about that later in this
As a
game,
matter
or
of
later
fact,
in
that's
this.
something we should consider in
slideshow.
terms of adding
Um,
challenge to the game. Like,
So what is internal variation, and how do how do resource systems help us make internal variation?
It gets stronger.
Someone tell me
the
this.
ball also gets smaller, so it's harder to aim it.
I already kind of explained this, so Luke.
Internal variation is to make it where the player is not doing the same thing every single, in a card game, I guess, every single turn.
Mhm.
Zero, like the highest
And
value.
what was the other question?
And how do resource systems help us create internal variation?
They usually break the game up into stages of like early stages, low resource, mid stage, medium resource, late stage, high resource.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you had a phone, you could like put it.
Exactly. Can someone think of another way that we could use resources to create internal variation that isn't just early game, mid game, late game, increasing amounts of resources? Doesn't need to be a good idea, just a way to do it.
I mean, wouldn't it just be like any cards that you can have that can alter how much resources you get or how you are able to spend them?
In theory, yes.
You should
Yeah.
work on is making that sort of fluctuating.
Magic, you have to draw your lands,
Mhm.
so throughout the game,
have it,
it's
like,
not
fluctuate
actually
between 0 and
consistent how
2.
much resources you have, like,
Mhm. But you still have a mid early.
yeah, I guess statistically, you're still more likely to have, like, less resources
Yeah.
in exchange.
It depends on the direction.
But yes,
There's
it
some
is
very bitter
probabilistic,
variation.
and that is
There's
interesting,
either
and we will
that
talk
as an
about that.
option, or,
I mean,
you know, there could
that
be
it's like
introduction of
Magic
objects
versus
that
like
you don't
Hearthstone,
want
where in
to
Hearthstone
have
every turn you get an extra
objects
mana.
that
Mhm.
That's very
you knock
consistent.
down
Yeah.
off the ground.
And that does create interesting variation. I would argue that's more external variation than internal variation. The fact that you draw different lands different turns. The difference between external and internal variation is a different workshop entirely, so we're not going to talk about that. But yes, that actually I would say yes, that is very much a source of variation for resources, is varying what resources you get at all over the course of a game and when you get them. It does create variation.
Like I do feel like
What kind of
Anything else? Anyone else to contribute?
well, there'll all be like, you know, the cube objects.
Okay.
I'm thinking some kinds of
Um,
objects
and then-
that you don't want to have knocked down on the ground.
Kind of
that triggers
touched
some
on this
sort of, like,
lightly. The
state
last
of
real
life.
big thing that resources give us is that they'll really open up the range of what we can do with card design.
Yeah, like if
If every card needs to be equally viable to every other card, in some sense, right?
And then
If every card means, because you want cards, the choice between two cards to be roughly equal so that it's an interesting decision, which one do I want to put in my deck, which one do I want to play?
we get on
Everyone agree on this concept?
They don't necessarily.
So,
I was thinking about
if
something like
every
this.
card
We
has
don't
to be
want
roughly equal, that's a really big burden on card design is, you know, I can't make a 10-10 and a 2-2
If they fall at
in the
two,
same
then
game
you lose.
inherently, because why would I ever play the 10-10 over the 2-2? Resource systems give us a really easy answer to this question.
Yeah.
Just make them cost more.
Just make them cost more. All of a sudden, I can now make both the 10-10 and the 2-2 and have it be an interesting decision in my game. Right? I have
in terms of
thus just
having
obviously
maximum
or
mental
straightforwardly
health
grown the number of different cards I can make,
and
which is
on top of
valuable
that,
because
you
card
probably
games
want
usually want to make
programs
thousands
that
upon
they
thousands of
get
cards.
pushed by another
Um,
then they lose.
Also, in the late game, you're not just comparing your 8/8 to your 8 cost card to your other 8 cost card. You're comparing your 8 cost card to your 4 cost card with your 2 cost card and 2 1 cost card.
And that's an interesting decision right there. And that is enabled by resource systems. Any questions, comments, concerns about how resource systems allow us to make a wider breadth of different types of cards?
Can you think of any card games that you've played that are good that don't rely on any sort of resource system?
Keyforge relies remarkably less on its resource systems than most card games do, but it still has resource systems and they are still vital to it.
Resource system is kind of broad.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Because
You could probably label any exchange of things in your game as a resource system.
Mhm.
So
Drawing a card is a resource usually.
Would
yeah,
selecting
I
house
guess
in
I guess
Keyforge-
by definition
Mhm.
it's
Selecting
also
a
not
house in
have a
Keyforge
resource
counts.
system if your
Yes,
cards
that is
are
what I'm
resource
counting as the
system.
resource system in Keyforge.
I mean, if you have a game where you start with a static fixed hand of exactly these cards, and you never draw cards, then you could have a resourceless game. But-
Imagine how that would go.
You know what's a card? Yeah, you're right. BattleCon.
Wait, seriously?
BattleCon does not rely on resources. There we go.
That's whack.
It has a resource system. It is not. It does serve a job.
Yeah.
That job could be served with a non-resource system pretty easily if they had chosen to go down that route.
Is it more like an optional resource system?
Well, it's still, there was a job that needed to be done, but they're actually using the resource system as a catch-up mechanic, not for any of these things we just described.
Okay. I suppose that
All of these things are dealt with in ways that don't really count as resource systems.
Makes sense for a
Yeah,
fighting
that's-
game, huh?
Yeah.
That's whack. I mean, you can draw the same combos every single game if you.
No,
Not
because
every
the
single game, but like
Oh,
you
yeah.
start with the same tools in hand.
Yep.
Most
most of the variation in that game comes from Yomi.
Controls would make it a lot easier to
What's
see
Yomi?
articulate
predict your opponent.
your movement or your control.
Oh, you Are people in that game limited to only what they have in hand to play, or is there something else?
Yeah, it's just your hand, and then you can see the cards that are on.
So you know what someone's started hand with entirely.
You get a preference for the
Yep.
other opponent's
well, you know everything they have at hand, and therefore you
And
predict
most
them
of your-
perfectly turn one.
Most of your cards are
Well,
pretty
but
much objective.
that's what Yomi
Oh, that's,
is.
okay.
Yomi is the idea that you can't predict another human perfectly because humans are inherently kind of a chaotic system.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay.
Yeah.
Neat.
And so the idea of me trying to predict you trying to predict me introduces enough chaos into the system that it varies.
Well, I mean, one resource in that game that kind of influences the decision of trying to read the other person is, you said something about cards being on cooldown.
Yeah.
If you literally don't have access to this card,
Correct.
suddenly you have a smaller pool, it's
So
less random what you'll choose.
You can interpret cooldown as a major resource system in that game. You can also interpret the fact that you can only play one card per turn as a major resource system in that game, if you wanted to. But I think that's kind of a stretch.
Okay, fair.
General constraint.
Any other questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings about the roles and importance of resources in card games?
If you had like infinite
No,
time.
sir.
Cool. Hmm?
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna.
Okay, so now we're just gonna, as we do in this workshop series, go through a bunch of different broad classifications of resource systems. Again, I happen to have forgotten one this time. I forgot the Yu-Gi-Oh system, as was politely. Yeah, I didn't talk about it on these slides. There are lots of them. This list is admittedly not exhaustive, but it's very close. There are a lot on this. And we'll just talk about them and the different things they do and how they work. Why do you keep doing things to me? What's wrong with you? Okay, so refreshing resource systems. These are the oldest. These go back to Magic. The basic idea of a refreshing resource system is at the start of your turn, the game says this is how many resources you'll have this turn. No matter how many resources you had left over at the end of your last turn or how many you spent last turn, you're trying to start the next turn with the same amount of resource, right? Doesn't matter if I tapped 4 lands last turn in Magic, I'm going to untap all my lands and still have all 6 of my lands and start in the next turn, right? That is the idea of a refreshing resource system. These are very common, used a lot. They're in Hearthstone, they're in Magic,
Like, let me look up.
they're
Yeah,
in
I'm gonna have
Keyforge,
microtransactions.
They're very common.
yes,
But it's
they're
not-
extremely common.
Not completely mandatory,
Totally.
you know, because they could just.
Fun stuff.
Yeah. This system asks lots of interesting questions about the idea of efficiency. Because you lose resources a lot, right? Any resource you don't spend on a given turn is effectively lost. That creates this really interesting scenario of how many resources am I willing to burn? How many resources am I willing to just throw away in the name of doing something better or timing myself a little better?
I don't know why.
This bleeds over to a lot of just general game design. Respawning players in any game can be thought of as a resource system in multiplayer games.
Mm-hmm.
And it does interesting things
Yeah.
with relatively user player efficient.
Yep.
Counter-Strike does this well. I'm sure there's other examples, but this is a very general, very applicable topic to a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a little bit. I felt like this.
Good morning, Mr. President Emeritus. Do you want to learn about card games?
He's not Mr. President, it's Mr. Collins from his office.
That's why I called him President Emeritus.
Okay.
But I don't know what that would mean, but I assumed it means not the president.
Not anymore.
It's like former with great honor.
Flex, but okay.
Is there a word for former with little honor?
Probably.
Disgrace.
Fallen.
Punished Venom president.
Anyways,
I think we have a bit of an idea of where
moving on.
President's a resource system.
like in terms of.
If you try hard enough.
Can we spend him?
If
I
you
think
try
it's
hard,
all
it's up to you. You're the game designer. If you want to just call your lands presidents, then yeah, there we go. Presidents are a resource system.
Alright, so there's precedent for it.
I sacrificed this president, summon President X.
There we go. Presidents are a resource system.
Summon Super Abraham Lincoln.
Okay. So
We don't need to think.
so yeah. Right. This asks interesting things about efficient clarification misgivings about these. They tend to play pretty smoothly because they're very automatic and just kind of automatically, often, especially if they're just kind of constantly ticking up, They very nicely regulate different phases of the game, and giving the player the appropriate amount of resource, because you just straight up say, hey player, this is how much resource you get in each given turn. There's not as much that's going to mess with that. Yeah. Cool. Flip the coin, we have persistent resource systems. So given the definition of a refreshing resource system, does anyone want to take a stab at what a persistent resource system is under this classification that I made up?
Is it like fixed? You have a certain amount all the time and from the beginning?
No. I'd put that more under refreshing, actually. Yes?
You can save across states of your game.
Exactly. You do get to save up your resource, is the idea here. Right? Does that, like, does the distinction that if I have 3 resources every turn, automatically, do you see how, for our purposes, that's refreshing?
Refreshing? Well, refreshing in the sense that you're getting more?
No, refreshing in the sense that you always reset.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. I was under the impression... Okay, yeah, never mind. I get it now. So this is like, you get to save up, like you can start, like, you get 3 your first turn, but by the end you might have 100.
Exactly.
Whereas instead of you get 3 every turn, then you have to spend that 3 every turn.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, talking about drawing cards for some reason.
Yes.
Keyforge would be a refreshing resource system when it comes to cards, and Magic would be a persistent.
Exactly. That is the exact distinction here. Right, and in Keyforge you now have this question of, you know, if I can play out my hand, that's the optimal thing to do. How far do I want to get to play out my hand? Whereas in Magic, you have this idea of, I want to save up. I want to wait.
So I'm confounding for that in Keyforge is that not every resource under that view of cards is made the same.
Mm-hmm.
And the inherent, like, one of the questions that refreshing resource systems tend to pose well at you is, do I do this all now, even though it might not be the right time?
Mm-hmm.
That's amplified in Keyforge.
Yes.
You might want to hold on to cards because you're like, this wouldn't have much effect this turn, but it really could in another one.
I agree with that full-heartedly, yes.
But it's wasting a resource to save that one.
Mm-hmm.
No.
So it's kind of about
Magic
saving
is
and refreshing.
Wait, no, Magic is persistent.
Yeah.
Because, so persistent, say you get like 3 energy every turn. But if you only spend 1 energy on the previous turn, then now you have 5 energy on the next turn.
In Magic?
Magic
No.
is persistent in cards in hand.
Yeah. Oh,
Not persistent in mana.
Right.
Mana is a refreshing resource. Cards in hand in Magic are a persistent resource.
You can keep accruing cards, whereas in Keyforge.
Because cards in hand are in fact a resource. They're one of those things that we're not really talking about, but if you actually try to apply this lens to them, it fits perfectly.
I think this is
really clever way of doing animation.
Is there anything else you want to know from you? There's the humans concept. Like, I would like to make.
Yeah, so the big interesting thing with persistent resources is now we're actually asking players to do like the real managing game. In a refreshing system, the resource is kind of managed, right? Players have interesting questions about waste, but players can't really screw themselves out of resource or worry about keeping it very much because, hey, next turn it'll reset, they'll be fine. In a persistent resource, you get to play the game of, hey player, you want to spend all that? Hey, you want to do all the things? You can. Why don't you do it? You have that option. And then 2 turns later, they're just like, well, now I'm out of everything because I just spent everything. Right? You are giving them that agency to really get to manage their resources and burn themselves on managing them poorly if they want to, and if they think that's an interesting choice, which can be really cool. A lot of games that do these really lean into that perspective. If you talk to anyone who played Netrunner back when that existed, Netrunner had a persistent resource system, right? All your money that you have, you just keep from turn to turn, and managing your economy was a huge part of the strategy of that game, right? Making sure you had regular inflows of investing resources and keeping regular influx of resource, knowing when it's worth it to spend your resource and when it's worth it to just stockpile, when it's worth it to just blow everything on one glorious run, was a big part of the strategy of that game. Right, and that's something that persistent resources uniquely allow you to lean into because they really give the player all the opportunity to manage their resource however they want to. The flip side of that coin is, well, now your player has to worry about managing a resource, and if that's not what your game's about, maybe a resetting resource is better for you. Also, keep in mind that, oh yeah.
I guess just another difference between the two is that this is a more lasting impact on game state because of the resetting nature of resetting resource systems. That part of the game state resets.
Yep.
And persistent, even though it says persistent, if you blow it all of it, that low amount persists.
Yep.
So you can feel the impact of turns past, and you're being forced to be optimal every turn to stockpile if you want.
Exactly.
Whereas you can be sloppy in the other way and get your resources back.
Yep.
What about Magic's like max hand size, where at some point the persistent kind of becomes refreshable for like a turn? Or is that just like
Yeah.
a mechanic for a different thing that it's trying to solve?
You could make an argument that when you're playing close to the maximum hand size, because you are automatically drawing cards that you can't stockpile, it starts to behave like a resetting resource and not like a persistent resource. But I wouldn't still call it, I would still call it technically a persistent resource, even if it's not really behaving like one at that point.
I mean, in terms of cards in hand, it would look like resetting, but if you blow all the cards, you don't get them all back, so it's not actually ever going to reset.
Yeah, that's an important distinction.
So then, what's the purpose of max hand size in Magic?
To prevent you from stockpiling too much, because
Then it gets crazy.
sometimes one of the problems with these games is stockpiling is an option, and stockpiling can do really weird things to your game, where it can just completely flip the table on all your numbers.
So this is like controlling the valves. then?
Yeah. Again, all of these are broad classifications. There are lots of nuance to how you can implement all of these systems, and lots of different ways you can implement all of these systems. Right? We were just talking about the broad classifications and their general qualities. To actually implement any of these, you need to really dig into the nitty-gritty, and we just don't have time to. But yeah, that kind of transitions to the other thing that I want to talk about with persistent resource systems is persistent resource systems number curves behave really weird in persistent resources because you have that stockpile option. You know, the difference between a 3 drop and a 6 drop, or a unit something that costs 3 resource and something that costs 6 resource. In card game slang, we call those 3 drops and 6 drops. In a resetting resource system can be a lot, right? Because you cannot save up to get to that 6. You have to get 6 resources organically, which can take a while. In a stockpile system, you can inherently, if you can have a 3 drop, you just have to wait one more turn, presumably, to get that 6 drop. That 6 drop is a lot closer, right? It's only one more turn away. So that really messes with your number curve. Your number curve goes up a lot slower in a persistent resource system, right? The higher costs are much more tenable because you just have that stockpile option. So you have to be conscious about that when you're building number trees. Except for when you're doing a pip system. A pip system is a specific subset of this system where you get exactly 1 resource automatically every turn. Pip systems actually are very expensive, and like even a 3 cost in a pip system can be insurmountable because you're giving up entire turns. But yes, just know that number curves are screwy with persistent resource systems, and don't expect to be able to just implement the number curve correctly if you're new to these kinds of systems. Questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings? Cool. So, hybrid systems. This is a thing that some games do because when you have 2 different sides of the coin and you're like, these both have advantages, obviously some designers are going to somewhere going to go, what if we could have both? Hybrid refreshing persistent systems tend to play, or cache systems as I'm calling them here, for reasons we'll get to, tend to play pretty interestingly. They're not that common, but they do exist and they have advantages. The general way that most games have found is the correct way to get the right sense of, hey, we have for both refreshing and persistent, as opposed to just accidentally well, we really have a persistent resource system, but also you just get back some stuff for free every turn if you spend it, is the idea that if you want to use your persistent resource, you have to cash it out, and then you only have to spend it all in one turn. It's a very common conception to kind of bring in more of that, to make the refreshing resource more important, so that you can't just stockpile and then turn it into a persistent resource game, if that makes sense. Did that make it? Can somebody explain back to me what I just said, please?
To give an example, it's like logos and Forge where you can keep cards on the side.
Exactly. And why did I just try to justify that they want to do that?
So that they can create a card advantage on a later turn.
Not why does the Logos player want to do that? Why do the Keyforge players want you to have to cash it out deliberately as opposed to just putting more cards directly into your hand?
They're opposites. It's a different type of resource, and it creates an interesting thing to keep track of. Well, I have the refreshing cards in hand, but these will always be there. I'll take them all out, but then they won't refresh.
Mm-hmm.
It's another thing you can spend, but it's not a refreshing source.
Yes. And one of the very common qualities of these non-refreshing resources is that most game designers who use these force you to use them. If you decide to tap into your non-refreshing pool,
All of them at once.
you have to use all of them at once.
Okay.
Does anyone want to venture explanations for why they force you to use them all at once?
So that you can't just increase your energy by excess amount. It's actually like a special thing of, okay, now I saved up these and now I have to use them, but if I don't use them right now, they either affect my refresh, like in Keyforge, or I lose them next turn.
Mm-hmm.
Also, to tap more into that inherent challenge of not persistent refreshing, or is it refreshing? Having a bunch of resource and having to spend it all in one turn as like a challenge. Because if you could only choose to take a few out, then you could just take as you need, as opposed to take it all out and then be forced to, well, how do I use this all optimally, even though it might not be the optimal turn for it.
Correct.
It pushes more of a challenge onto the player to use it well if they have to take it all out.
Yep. I think that's kind of what there is to be said about these systems. They're cool. They're a little complicated, like most hybrid systems.
I was just confused by the word cash out when you initially explained it. That's why it was a little hard.
Yeah. Cash out, take your entire stockpile and go for it.
Yeah, see, checkout would have, I don't know,
Yeah.
take all is what
Yes.
that means, but
Yeah.
words are hard.
Yeah. Here's an illustration of one of these systems in action. There's my mouse, right? This is a game called Rosmaga. It's pretty good if you want to play it. Yeah. But here's your refreshing pool, right? You get straight out of Hearthstone, every turn you get one more star, and then all your stars automatically fill up at the start of your turn. But also you have this pool of special stars. You'll slowly accrue special stars over the course of the game, right? You'll start with 0, and then as stuff goes on, you'll get 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 19 is actually a lot in this game. And if you ever want to, you can always just click this button, and then all of a sudden they'll all flow over and fill up your normal star meter. But your normal star meter is going to reset next turn, so
Use it while you can.
yeah. Cool little system they have. Any questions, comments, concerns about hybrid systems?
I guess Magic kind of does this sometimes with like treasures.
Yep.
Tap for an extra mana that turn.
Yep. I would put treasures in this category, yes. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings? Cool. Randomize. So on a totally different axis, a lot of resource systems randomize themselves. Right? Magic is randomized, as we already talked about. What lands you get when is random. Any game that uses resources based on cards in hand, right? That's inherently random. In Ashes, which is one of my favorite card games, right? You're rolling dice to get resources. What colors of mana you have effectively is all dependent on what sides come up in your resource dice when you roll them. That's random.
Vaguely like Catan, at the very last point, what resources you get or what uses the land is.
Correct. That is exactly what I'm talking about there. Now, good that you caught that. It means that I wrote my slide well. And also that you were thinking about things and learning things. These are all good things. Okay. It says on the board, but who can venture a guess why randomizing resources might be asking for a lot? Random is a vital part of game design. It's very important. It does lots of good things for us.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yes. Why is
Random in pathological cases often does really, really screwy things. Specifically, mana screw.
that is exact? Yep. There we go. It can do really weird things to you, including really weird things that completely throw off the course of your game.
If your game doesn't play correctly because they got 10 very rare, very unfortunate things in a row,
Yep.
that's a problem.
Yes, exactly. Right. Your game should play correctly. If random chance can just kind of flip the table on your game, you're not in a great spot. And resource systems are in a very important, or in a kind of a posed position to do this, because resource systems are what was I going to say? Because resource systems often dictate your player's agency, and if you haven't picked up this trend in most of my workshops, you usually have a very good conception of exactly how much agency your player needs, and if your random system can tweak that amount of agency, it can go really mess up your gameplay. Right? You don't want to leave how much agency your player has up to chance. You want to give your player the appropriate amount of agency. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications that given with that inherent threat?
This results in funny situations where, like, in a turtle, half the time I'm just, most of my like deck building and stuff is me fighting against the randomization. And if I'm winning against the randomization, I tend to be winning against my opponent in most cases. But, so like, it adds some intriguing and fun aspects to the game in some situations when you've got,
certainly does, yeah.
when you've got cards that allow you to negate or overcome the randomization, like draw more cards and stuff like that. But then when you're losing, it doesn't feel like you lost to the player you were playing against. It felt like you lost to the
numbers,
structure of the game itself, which is not as satisfying as losing to an opponent on skill.
Exactly correct.
And as a whole, that can, because sometimes you're not entirely certain which one you're losing to, that can decrease the amount of satisfaction of winning, because you feel like, oh, I just got good random, he got bad random cards, and then I won. So it's not as fun as actually strategically surpassing your opponent.
Anyone else want to comment on this problem? Yes.
A little thing, but it's not necessarily a problem when your random resource system allows for a case where it's just garbage, as long as that's exceedingly rare. The average case should be players have enough agency to do what they want to do and it be an interesting game.
I mean, that comes down to, as a game designer, how many games of your game do you think is an acceptable amount to not actually be games of your game?
Yeah, ideally 0, but if you're playing with a randomized system, that's not necessarily always going to be the case.
Sometimes it can be kind of funny to watch random numbers like fuck each other up. Like,
they're cool tools, but it's easy to let them flip the script.
So, one of the things I'm going to propose here is that, right, one common thing you can always do is you can always just build in systems that undo the messiness of your resource system, right? If the resource system just starts to get really screwy and give your player a really weird number of resources, you can just introduce a system where they have choices on how to get around that, right? Like the game Spellweaver did a system where if you aren't drawing enough lands, you can just tutor a land out of the top 4 cards of your deck, and if you're drawing too many lands, you can always pitch lands, pay a small cost, and pitch lands to draw non-lands.
I just really like the mini.
2 examples, Netrunner being able to spend resources to just gain credit immediately, and in pretty much every game, the idea of a mulligan is just that.
Yep.
Incarnate.
Though you're still ultimately in that case leaving yourself up to chance, you're just pushing off where the chance gets manifested, hopefully into a less destructive place. The system I really advocate for, as said on the bottom, is that, right, we've talked about a lot of virtue. Everyone's clear on the virtues of randomized resources, right? Why you want them? Right? They create interesting things. They create variance. They force the player into scenarios they don't expect. All the generally good things about randomness. The fun gameplay that Luke talked about of having to fight the random resource to make your deck run consistently is really interesting gameplay that a lot of people who play Eternal or Magic will rave about the quality of, except for when it just completely screws them over. So there is virtue here, right? But how do we get that virtue without the big downside? Well, the argument that I'm going to make is the best thing you can do is you can randomize what, but not how much, right? Ashes, you are going to roll 10 dice. You are going to have 10 dice worth of resource, no matter what. And one die is a unit of resource in Ashes. What's going to be interesting is, well, what side did they come out on? What did I roll? Am I going to get a bunch of lions? Am I going to get a bunch of snakes? Am I going to get a bunch of hearts? And that impacts your gameplay because that impacts what cards and how many of those cards you can play. But you still always get to play 10 dice worth of cards no matter what. Right? So you always have the same amount of agency. It's just what agency gets randomized, right? Or in the dual master system, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, right? Where every card's a land, well, I always have one new land worth of agency per turn, because I'm always running a card per turn. The question is, which of these cards? What color is it going to be, right? That randomizes what type of resource, but not how much, right? I think that generally tends to give you the best of both worlds without the problem of, well, you just got screwed out of having any agency. You always have the right amount of agency. The game fixes that, it just doesn't fix what agency you get. And you generally get those interesting decisions about, I didn't expect to have to make this decision out of just doing what agency and not how much. Questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings about this conception?
I'm not sure if this is a correct example, but if you were to take Magic and take all the lands out of a deck and move that into its own deck and randomize it.
Yes, that is what I'm talking about.
At the start of the turn, the player gets to choose which deck to draw from, but then they don't know what of card, but they still get to control how much.
Yep, that would fall into this. I would see value in that system, yeah. You could see that game playing quite well.
They have fixed Magic.
Lots of people have tried. Lots of people have gotten close. That's very that's very close to how Force of Will proposed to solve the problem. The Force of Will allowed you to draw one card from both decks. And Force of Will generally plays quite well. It's not a bad game. Has problems. Not a bad game. Any other questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings about the role of randomness in resource systems? Okay. This next slide is just kind of the exact flip side of the coin. Well, what if we just take out all randomness from the resource system and just give you a resource per turn? This is the Hearthstone solution.
Didn't we already talk about this? How is this different than refreshing?
Refreshing is a broad category of my resources go up every turn. What resources you get might be randomized, a la Magic, where I have to randomly draw lands, or I might just get one for free, a la Hearthstone. What's important is that in refreshing is that they go up. What's important here is that
randomization's cut out. It's all the same.
You can have a persistent automatic resource system. The aforementioned pip system, where you just get one pip per turn, would fall into that intersection. But yeah, these tend to take a lot of the hassle out. They tend to play very consistently. Just make it so that this isn't the thing your players have to worry about. Downside is you don't get all the upsides of random resources that we talked about. Upside is you don't get all the downsides of random resources that we talked about. And they tend to be simpler. These do tend to be simpler. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings about these? They're just kind of the complement of what we just talked about. So
It's like the smallest possible unit way to implement refreshing. In essence.
Or persistent.
Okay, that's fine.
Because pips, right?
So the idea here is
not just refreshing in like Hearthstone, like refreshing mana, but also that you gain 1 mana per turn.
The idea is not, this has nothing to do with refreshing.
Oh, sorry.
This has everything to do with whatever is happening, it's just happening because the rules tell you it's happening, not because I did anything to make it happen, right? The idea that I don't have to do anything in Hearthstone to gain a mana crystal, Hearthstone is just going to give me a mana crystal.
Oh, okay.
Or in a pip system, I don't have to do anything to earn a pip. The game's just going to give me a pip per turn, right?
So this system allows you to either simplify your game and like open it up to like a larger audience, or to take the complexity of your game and move it to a different area while keeping a resource system right there.
Correct. That was why you would want to simplify a system, yes. Well said. Or do both.
Yeah.
It also allows you to get out of mana screw, because that'll never happen, because you're always going to get your mana for free. Or your pip for free, or whatever it is. Questions, comments, concerns? Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, things about this? Cool. Now I'm going to talk about one of my favorite systems, because I love it, and I want to talk about it, so I'm going to talk about it. So this falls under the category that I was just advocating for of randomized what but not how much resource systems. The idea of a discard-based resource system is that instead of having a separate resource that you have to draw out of your deck, you still are getting your resources randomized out of your deck, but it's every single card, because every single card doubles as a resource, and you have to discard it to cash in on that resource, right? Yes.
It's like vaguely
A little bit. You can compare this to scrying, and every time you scry both a land and an on-land. Though I would say that's a bit of
tangential.
yeah. Right. It is definitely the idea of I kind of get some agency over what I'm trying. Right now, every single card is an interesting strategic conundrum on a low level because, hey, do I want a resource or do I want whatever the hell this is? That's a conundrum right there.
So like Pledge?
This is exactly like Pledge, yes.
So Pledge only exists on your first turn.
Yeah, but this is like the entire game
Okay.
runs off Pledge. But yes, that is exactly what a Pledge is an implementation of. This is done this originally came out in Duel Masters, I think is the original game to do this, where every single card you can just play as a land, and then once it's a land, it's a land. WoW TCG does something very similar. The WoW TCG version is a little bit different because WoW TCG takes away the conception of colors. So now it's not which color land do I want to play, it's just which of these cards do I want the least. But WoW TCG adds in this interesting idea of quests, which are cards that only can be played as lands, but they give you a bonus effect while they're lands, which can be useful. Because now we do get a lot of that design space of resource-specific cards that do interesting things as resources back that we lost when we took away specific land cards. But now because a much smaller percentage of your deck has to be land cards, and you're still able to play land cards even if you don't draw your quests. And if you do draw just quests, well, you won't because you're playing so many fewer quests.
Yeah.
It tends to run very smooth.
And if you're just getting quests, then you're not getting the cards that you actually use to play the game.
But that's not going to happen because you just don't run that many quests in your deck because you don't need that many quests, right? You never need a quest. If you get a quest, it's like, hey, cool. I'm going to play it as my resource for this turn is to do something cool. Also, most quests help you draw cards, so if you do get quest flooded, these are quests to draw cards.
I think the same card advantage becomes very important in these kinds of games.
It can. A little bit less so because, it depends on the other systems, honestly. Because, if I can only play one land per turn, and then it doesn't matter if I have 5 cards or 6 cards, I'm going to play one of them as my land, right? Though it does give you an interesting decision of, do I want card advantage or do I want resource? Because, well, if I have, it allows you to play on that. It's like, I can play out more lands, I can keep playing up to more lands as long as I have cards in my hand, but that's going to burn my card advantage. Or I can say, well, actually, I'm only going to want
card
5.
advantage as in having the choice to either use the cards and spend a bunch of stuff.
I'm confused what you're...
Multiple discard.
So you're using cards as a resource?
Yes.
Right? So then just having more cards means you have more options.
Yeah, it can. Yes, very much. Yeah, I would agree with that.
And this gives you, so like if you have like cards that, if you've got early game cards, mid game cards, and late game cards.
Mhm.
If you get a late game card in the early game, it's not that big a deal. You can just use it as a resource in the early game. And if you get an early game card in the late game, then now you have a resource right there. And so
Yep.
you never draw a card that you can't use.
Yes. This also poses the very interesting strategic conundrum if you do the colored version of this. Let's say in my hand I have 5 mediocre red cards and 2 fantastic blue cards, right? Well, I have 2 options. I can play one of my mediocre red cards as a land, and then play another mediocre red card as my card play for the turn, or I can use one of my 2 fantastic blue cards as my land and give up that great blue card. I'll never get to play it this game, but now I get to play the other great blue card from my hand this turn. This is very conducive to those kinds of scenarios, and lots of scenarios that permutate off of that I think play really well. I like this system. It's good.
It sounds nice.
I mean, you're also, hearing it from a very biased source.
Yes.
But
There's a WoW TCG that wasn't Hearthstone.
WoW TCG, Hearthstone was the digitalization, started as the digitalization of WoW TCG,
Oh, okay.
and then it kind of took on a life of its own. WoW TCG was better by accounts of most people who played both. It had problems. It was definitely older and rougher and more complicated in a lot of weird ways, but also a lot of the complexity they took out was doing work, and then they took it out and nothing's doing those jobs anymore. Like all the messy weirdness with the class system and why the classes are so weird often traces back to how the classes worked differently in MyTCG. But that's a total tangent that I shouldn't talk about right now because we need to get through the rest of this workshop. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications about discard-based resource systems? There's a resetting version, as I mentioned, where you use it as lands. There's also a persistent version where you just discard it for resources out of your hand once and then it's gone, you spent it, both work. The latter is one of the weird systems where you actually have to realize that everything is so much more expensive than it looks, because discarding 3 cards, like a 2-cost card, actually means 3 cards out of your hand. That's a lot. So if you ever use that system, it does play well. It has been done before. You have to realize that all your numbers are way more expensive than they look. Yeah, any other questions, comments, concerns? Cool, moving on. Non-depleted resources and leveling systems. This is the idea that, well, what if I don't actually ever spend my resource? What if I just have to have it, but as long as I have it, I can count as having it?
Like health?
No, you can spend health. Once you spend your health, the health is gone. This is the idea of, like, if I'm a level 2 ranger, I can play all my level 2 ranger cards. When I play one level 2 ranger card, I don't stop being a level 2 ranger. I'm still a level 2 ranger. I can still play my next level 2 ranger card.
So this is like, Matt, in Eternal you've got
Influence?
influence,
Correct.
and so this is like influence.
This is
so if you have
influence.
2 influence, you pay a thing that costs 2 influence, you still have that 2 influence.
Exactly. Now, calling these as a resource system is kind of weird because they don't actually get spent, and that's kind of an inherent definition of what it means to be a resource in most scenarios. You don't need to manage them. You can keep using the same 2 influence to play 2 influence cards ad infinitum. No management necessary. This is why it really counts as a leveling system and a progression system. That's why it says leveling system at the top. The reason we're talking about it in this workshop is because they tend to do a lot of the same work as resource systems we talked about in the beginning, right? They do limit your choices. They do break the game into phases as you level up. All that fun stuff. They do add, they do differentiate cards between, because you can have a high level card and a low level card, and that's a trade-off now that allows you to do more different things. The one thing they don't do is they don't force you to choose between 2 cards at the same cost, because, yes.
Would it be a gross oversimplification to say they basically just chunk up your game into discrete groups of this is the game at level 1, this is the game at level 2, this is the game at level 10?
I would not call that a gross oversimplification, no.
Okay.
That is an important job that they often are meant to do. Any questions, comments, clarifications about these systems? They're often very attractive in digital settings because there's very little management. You can just play cards automatically and the system can check and not have to worry about it. So a lot of digital games have this, like Eternal or Hex.
That makes sense. A lot of the burden of making sure you're at the right state in the game could be done by a computer without much fanfare.
Exactly. Yeah, question? Cool. They exist, they're useful. Space-based resource systems, these are cool. They're not done enough. I like them. These don't worry about how much you can play. These worry about how much you can have in play. Right? So the conception here is you have some size limit for what you can have in play. Right? For example, in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's 5. You have 5 monster spaces. In Hearthstone, you have 7 creature spaces. In a buddy fight, you have a max size of 3. In We Cross, you have on your character card, you have some max size, usually about 12. And then you can only fill up to that size. Once you hit that size, you're done. Right? So that's a resource. You have to spend that resource. You have to spend that resource to keep things in play. And once that space is being taken up, it's taken up. You can't put anything else there. This can do all the same jobs as other resources, but it has the interesting quality of it has nothing to do with what's coming out of your hand and everything to do with what your actual board state is. Right? It's not a cap on what you do per turn, it's a cap on your board state, which is an interesting distinction that you can do cool things with. It also, because of that, has a very interesting anti-snowball factor where you can actually only snowball so hard because eventually you're just going to run out of space.
You have the advantage a player can put out.
Yep.
Limit acceleration. Actually.
Yeah. The very simple systems, everything takes up the same amount of space, right? Like in Yu-Gi-Oh or Hearthstone, everything takes up 1 slot. In the more advanced version of this system, like We Cross or Buddy Fight, different things take up different amount of space, right? Like in Buddy Fight, you have 3 size, but you can play a 3-size monster. And well, there's my one and only monster. It's using up all 3 of my size, which is a cool space to have access to. Yes.
Okay. Heroes of the Storm does this in a neat way, where it's 5 characters. That's kind of like a space-based resource system, but there's 1 character that just 2 people control it, but it's powerful.
Right. Yeah. I'd say that more leans into the combat system because it's so player interaction heavy, but you could definitely interpret that as a resource system. You most certainly could, yeah.
It's a lead character. Diablo.
I guess.
Wait. What? No, they're wrong. He's a tall boy. I think he's the upper right in that poster.
I think Yu-Gi-Oh's like, it has like 2 spots in the middle of the board for Link summons.
Yep. That's very much a space-based
Yeah,
resource
it's
system.
like you can also fight over resources with your opponent.
Yep.
I think that's what design is.
Yu-Gi-Oh has like multiple resource systems.
Yeah. Most games have multiple resource systems. We're actually going to talk about that. Any other questions about space-based resource systems? They're cool. They're not done enough. That's about it. Okay. Deck building point systems. These systems give you a number of points that you can spend while building your deck. Right? I think the best example I've had of this is Chaotic, where Chaotic you have 20 points. You have a 20-card deck and you have 20 points worth of cards in your deck. If you want to put in a 2-point card, well, you have better put in a 0-point card to go with it. Right? If you want to put in a 3-point card, well, now you need to put in 2 0-point cards to go with it. The problem with this system inherently is, well, if I'm only going to play through the top quarter of my deck, which is a very common quality in card games, and a desirable quality because it creates variation in what cards you're playing with each game, if I draw just the 0, all the 0s out of my deck, and you draw all the 3s, it doesn't matter what else we had in that deck, I'm at a loss, because once a card is actually drawn during the game in this kind of a system, it costs as much to actually play a 3 as it is to play a 0, it just, the difference comes in putting it in the deck. So this generally works if you know that the player is going to have to play every card in their deck. So now it's not who gets to play the 3s and who gets to play the 0s, it's when do I play my 3s and when do I play my 0s, which is a much more interesting question. Again, a very underexplored one. It takes a lot of the simplicity, it takes a lot of the burden out of gameplay and puts it in deck building, which might be a thing you want to do. If you want to simplify your gameplay while still keeping that strategy there. Maybe make deck building a little more challenging and interesting for the players who like to deck build. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, things about this system? Cool. Victory tied resource systems. Some games like to try to tie in their resource system into their victory condition. I know that Oscar and Victor did this in one of the games they designed. It can work. It has worked. Vampire did this and it worked very well. It has an inherent problem because, well, now the winning player has more resource, has more victory condition, has more resource, has more agency, is going to win more. Is kind of an inherent problem with this system. Whereas the losing player has less win condition, has less resource, is going to win less. Yes.
The inverse of that, where the more you lose, the more potential you have. Vanguard does that in E1.
Yes. Yep. You can definitely use this as a catch-up mechanic if you invert that relationship, which is a cool thing. As seen in Vanguard, it works well. You can do them correlating and it worked well. The best way I've ever seen that implemented was in Vampire. The way Vampire kind of got out of it was basically every time you're using your pool, the resource / win condition in Vampire was called pool. Every time you're using pool as a resource, you're dealing with lots of pool, right? Like 3 pool is a cheap card to play. You're dealing with, you're happily spending 6 or 7 pool on a single Vampire. 10 pool is not unreasonable to spend in one go. Whereas if you're dealing with pool as a win condition, like if I can deal 2 pool worth of damage to you at once, that was a good turn. I'm really happy with myself. So what that means in reality is that you're not actually sharing resource in win condition effectively. You effectively have 25 pool, which is your resource to spend however the hell you want. And that last 5 pool is your actual win condition.
So basically your objective is to kill them after they've spent it, not as much to.
Yeah, right.
I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of does this too with life points. Cause you have cards where you can spend life points.
Yes.
In a way, I feel like Yu-Gi-Oh! Has like a big number of these resource systems. And they kept like kind of adding more, right? Like pendulums, Xyz.
Yes.
What's bolt range for dealing pool damage? Because there's kind of like a play of how much I invest in
1.
my creatures.
Bolt range is like 1.
Oh, so you put all of your pool out?
If you can, like you seriously you usually are only ever dealing with 1 pool at once, if even.
But if you just decide you don't want to die, just keep 2 pool.
Well, no, you can still. Now it's just double bolt range. I bolt you once, I bolt you twice.
Is the definition of bolt range within 1 turn?
Correct, but I can bolt you on 1 turn, come back around to the next turn.
Oh, pool does not refresh.
Pool does not refresh.
Oh, I see.
Pool is a persistent resource.
Is it allocated at the beginning of game?
Correct. Everyone gets 30 pool at the beginning of the game. That's your pool. Have fun with it. Don't spend it all in one place.
Okay.
It's an interesting interpretation of a resource system.
So if you can sit there and don't play any cards, it'll take them a long time to kill
You will lose the game. It will take a aggravating amount of time for you to lose the game, but you will lose the game.
Hi, here's my aggro deck. It's not about being aggressive, it's about making the other person very angry.
Yes. Yeah, Vampire's an interesting game. Okay. Any questions?
Does it still exist, or have they?
It's there is an organization called a volunteer organization called the something Council of Elder Princes something. They've got an awesome name that I can never remember. That keep it alive.
But the company isn't.
There is no company anymore. The organization has technically the rights still are with a company called White Wolf Publishing, but for all rights and purposes, the princes have it. Any other questions? Okay. The Keyforge resource system It's cool, so I want to talk about it. The way this one's really weird. As mentioned, this is the house system, right? Where the way it forces you to choose what you're going to play is by forcing you to choose one house of cards, right? Basically one color, and you can only play that color for a turn. That's doing all the jobs we just talked about, right? It's forced. You can only do so much. You can only do one house's worth of stuff. You have to choose. Well, you have to choose which house. It's just a very different way of interpreting your resource. Any questions?
What are the pros and cons of this system?
Well, it's new and only seen in one game, so it's hard to fully analyze it. Pros is it's very simple. Cons is it doesn't necessarily do all the jobs that well. They have to rely on a lot of secondary resources to get the jobs done, right? For example, this is not their safety release valve. It kind of is, because you can only do one house worth of things. So if you have an infinite combo, cool, the infinite combo is now in is broken across houses to make you forced to find really shenanigans ways to get them back together. So you can actually use them together, because you can usually only use one house internally. The real limiting resource, the real safety release valve in Keyforge is the rule of 6. The idea that you can only use a card 6 times in the same turn is the real safety release valve. They weren't able to rely on the house system to be the end-all safety release valve.
Why can you only use the card 6 times?
Because the rules say so.
Yeah, straight up.
This is a downside. We are putting this in the downside categories, is they had to go find something called the rule of 6, or invent something called the rule of 6 to act as their safety release valve, because their resource system wasn't going to do it for them. Yeah. Right? And that's an additional rule that no one knows about until you go and read the one paragraph that mentions it, entitled The Rule of 6. It has nothing to do with anything else in the game. That's generally not very good game design. But they needed to do it because their resource system wasn't going to do that job for them.
And they couldn't ensure that Dex wouldn't do that.
Yeah. The flip side is they get this very elegant, simple resource system that can create interesting choices that most games don't get to ask. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Does that answer your question then?
Yeah. Well, I was just reading your question.
Yes. Oh, damn it. Okay. Well played. Well, I just answered the question that I was going to ask you guys, because I forgot to remember what my slides were about. So, multiple resource systems. We've kind of been talking about these. As it's kind of started to emerge in our discussion, most games have lots of different resource systems, or at least multiple. That's very common. Many of them are very small, but most games do have, and then there's one primary one, but many games have multiple primary ones. There are multiple reasons why you might want to do this. One example, right, is like Vanguard and Bushiroad in general have this great habit of saying, hey, here's this thing that our game, this byproduct of our game that our game is just naturally producing. Like, hey, we're stacking up cards underneath your Vanguard because you keep playing new Vanguards on top of it. What if that was a resource? And thus was born Soul, which is just a persistent resource in this game that you get one of every time you play a new Vanguard. You have, right, or like damage is just like, hey, you're keeping track of damage. What if damage was a resource, right? Bushiroad is very good at seeing these things. They cost very little because it's collateral. The system is already there. This thing is already being tracked because of your game naturally. Now you're just tapping into it as an additional resource. It's very low cost. You can do cool things with it. Doesn't necessarily do any work for you per se, but if it's no cost, it doesn't need to do a lot of work, or low cost, low amount of work necessary to justify itself.
Will the cards remaining in your deck be a resource if when you deck out you lose?
Even if you deck out, you didn't lose. You just stopped drawing cards. That would still be a resource, as long as you can run out of it and spend it and make it do those 4 drops we talked about at the beginning. That can most certainly be a resource, and would definitely fall into this category of, hey, it's collateral, so might as well.
Even if a deck refreshes like Keyforge, it would still be a resource of what's left, if it's random.
Assuming, yeah, but then it's not really, because like you still have infinite cards in deck to pay.
Yeah, but at what point in time?
Well, always, because the deck is effectively bottomless. if I have 10 cards left in my deck, I can still play a 10 card and then a 10 card.
But if you've played, say you have 30 cards, if you played 24 cards, and you're about to draw, and there are 24 cards, some of them are on the field, some of them in your hand,
Yeah.
some of them are in the discard pile, and there's 6 cards left in the pile, and you know what every single one of your cards is, then you know what cards you're going to get in the next couple of turns, because the discard pile doesn't automatically get
Correct.
shuffled in.
But now we're dealing with probabilistic nature of the deck, which I think has a lot less to do with resources and a lot more to do with randomness. It turns out, doesn't matter how much you know about what's in your deck, it's still random. It's now just less random, and turns out less random isn't actually a cost, it's a good thing. So even if I know that the bad cards are in my discard now and the good or even if I know that the good cards in my deck are in my discard now and my bad cards are in my deck, that is actually preferential to I don't know if the good cards are at the bottom or the good cards are at the top, because now I have information. Right? So yeah, I would say that you have to take out refreshing to make spending cards in deck an interesting resource.
I meant something like not that, which was, say you need 1 card in deck and all cards are not the same. You've already played it, it's in your discard, but you still have 6 cards in your deck.
Yeah.
You're at most 7 cards away from your 1 thing, which is a resource of time, sort of.
Kind of, yeah.
What about Weiss, where refreshing costs you a damage?
Now
it's
you
still
can start
positive.
making an argument again that we're back into, you use it as a resource because, well, there is a penalty, you are spending something, but now we're just kind of shirking what you're spending onto the damage. The resource ultimately spent is really the damage here. Does that make sense?
As long as there's like a cost associated to refreshing.
Yeah, because you're still spending something, now you're just spending the cost to refresh as opposed to never getting the cards back into your deck.
Then if you didn't want to refresh, you could keep that little bit of health.
You can also might want to consider having multiple resource systems if your systems don't do all the jobs you need them to do. Right? We talked about a lot of systems that like, hey, this doesn't do this job super well. That job still needs to get done, so maybe you just introduce a second resource system that does do that job really well to do that job. I think that's a pretty straightforward concept and questions. Eternal's a great example of that. It has 2 resource systems, influence and power. They both are very limited in what they do, but they complement each other very well and pick up for each other's slack. And then I think one of the most interesting uses you can actually do with multiple resources is if you have a thing in your game that is really fun. For example, putting on armor. If you think that putting on armor is such a fun thing in your game, but players will never spend resource to put on armor because, oh my god, is swinging a sword so much more an effective use strategically of resource? Introduce a new resource that you can only ever spend. It's a great resource, use of having multiple resources. Any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, misgivings? Cool. I have a phone call that I promised I would be on in 25 minutes ago, so thank you for coming to my workshop, and I will talk to you in a week.